Good. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about the Normans in the Welsh Marches. I've spent a lot of time thinking and working on the Normans, and I still, like Keith, don't fully understand them. But I think probably what is very important about the Normans is that they represent a conquest which is well recorded. And although we don't understand the minutiae of that, we can see the way they took over a country in a very effective and rapid way. And much of what we see in the landscape today is a reflection of that process of taking over England and the Welsh Marches. You can see here my opening slide emphasizes that the Normans did have an enormous impact on the landscape. And that you can see this extraordinary concentration of castles in the border, going right down from following the line of Offa's Dyke from Cheshire right down to Chepstow. But you can see how it overflows into Wales, and the process of actually conquering parts of Wales is part of the story of the Normans. One aspect of this which is intriguing, and I think again we don't fully understand, is that there was a Norman presence in the Welsh border before 1066. Edward the Confessor had been in exile in Normandy, or at least on the continent, for many decades, and when he returned to England he brought with him a number of knights and clerics, several of whom he settled in the Welsh Marches, and some of whom appear to have constructed castles ahead of the conquest. We normally think of castles being a post-1066 phenomenon, but there is some evidence to suggest that at Richard's Castle, in particular, up here, just to the south of Ludlow, at Hereford itself, and possibly at Ewes Harold, there were castles built in the 1040s or 50s. As I say here, several of these Normans who accompanied Edward were settled in this area, and in particular, one Richard Scrobb was located in Oratone, up here to the south of Ludlow, what is now Ludlow, and created a castle and the name of which is reflected in his name, Richard Scrobb. I have to say that there's still a good deal of discussion about the precise dates of these, and archaeologically none of these have yet been proven, although there have been work on certainly Richard's Castle and Hereford. Hereford Castle, not so perhaps so well known as others, because it was destroyed in the 17th century, before the Civil War and during the Civil War. The Great Keep here was taken down, rather unusually, because they are such formidable structures that normally they are not destroyed. They survive when everything else disappears. And we think that Hereford Castle was first built by an Earl of Hereford called Ralph the Timid, and it was sacked by the Welsh in 1055, and then rebuilt after the conquest by the Earl of Hereford, William Fitz-Osborne. and again attacked immediately after the conquest by one of these sort of freebooter sort of nationalists, if you like, Edric the Wild, who is sort of rather like Hereward in the East Anglia, but he rather, I always think that Edric really sort of spoils his copybook, because he starts off as a sort of a thorn in the side of the Normans, and then when he sees the way that the Normans are going to take over, he joins them. So that seems to be, rather detracts from his sort of charisma as a rebel. The Saxon town defences and the castle were repaired by Harold Godwinson. There was a lot of activity actually down here in this part of the world in the decade or so before the Norman Conquest. Harold himself had conducted campaigns into Wales, and clearly there were the sort of forerunner of what happens after 1066. I'm not going to go into the details of Hereford Castle, but basically what survives is this castle green, which is basically the bailey of the castle. You can see how Hereford itself, that's the Saxon defences there, and that the castle was built within the eastern extension of the castle, of the burh, that the original crossing is somewhere down here to the south of the cathedral. There's an aerial view which shows how the Norman element, as it were, within Hereford takes over the whole of the centre of the city. There is the castle bailey, that's where the mound was, and that's the cathedral there. In fact, so effective is this takeover that it pushes the main line of communication further westwards, and eventually you see these bridges there are well to the west of the original crossing. They also, this takeover by the Normans with sort of a cathedral and cathedral annex features, and the castle is such that a new element to the town is created. I need to go back, actually. Oh, I would go back if I could, anyway. There, thank you. And I just want to point out this piece of landscaping. Here you can see this is the clear layout of the Anglo-Saxon street pattern of of Hereford, with the crossing coming down there. But this is broken up by this major Norman incursion here, and eventually a new east-west axis is created within an extension of the town defences there. That's the medieval defences to the north. So originally it was a north-south crossing town, but then eventually what they do is create a large open market area running on a totally different access to the original. So what I'm really claiming for the Normans is that eventually they caused the whole of the structure of Hereford to be reshaped. It's gone on strike. Oh, no, it hasn't. Anyway, there we are. We move up to Richard's Castle, this not so well-known site. It's about 5 miles to the south of where we are now. A massive motte there, that's a mound with a bailey, and there's the church, which presumably actually started off as a castle chapel with its separate bell tower, and then beyond that you have a failed borough. If you look at it in plan, there's our castle, there's the church, and around it are earthworks which indicate the presence of a borough which simply fails because it's in the wrong place, and it's dwarfed completely by Ludlow in the course of time. But this is one of the sort of major planks in the Norman takeover, the creation of a castle and of a borough that goes with it. Sometimes the borough is a little later, but the two go together. And here you can see what has happened is that the outer bailey, as it were, incorporates the earthworks of the failed borough. You could just see these tenement plots belonging to the Burgesses. There's Richard's Castle, and there's Mrs. Rowley acting as a scale, and you can see it, the mound there is absolutely massive. US Harold is a more difficult one, because although traditionally it is said that it was a pre-conquest castle built by Osborne Pentecost, who also was one of these knights who came across, and it was rebuilt by William Fitzosborne after the conquest, when, like Richard's Castle, it had a borough attached to it and a priory, but both of which have disappeared. But there is some question, actually, whether this was a pre-conquest castle, because it may well have been well into Welsh territory at the time, but maybe Keith can help us on that. There's a view of it with trees this time, but you can see how you've got the castle mound and then this great enclosure attached to it, part of a borough feature which has gone. This is one of these. The Royal Commission covered Hereford in the 1930s, and they did these lovely maps. So I thought I would just show you one of these, showing there's the mound, there's the castle mound, there's the outer bailey, and there's the site of the priory down there. On this slide, I'm just saying, according to John of Worcester, writing some time after the conquest, has to be admitted, Osborne and his associate Hugh surrendered their castles and went to Scotland. Actually got mixed up with Macbeth up there. But it's the use of the plural castles suggests there may well have been others in the area that we have not yet identified. So that was my first point, that there is a Norman presence here prior to 1066. In 1052, there is a rising against Edward the Confessor by the Godwinson family, who basically take over control. And at that stage, a large number of the Normans who come over are expelled or moved back to Normandy. A few stay on, but that is the end of that particular Norman exercise. But, as I say, Harold himself continues in his process of nibbling away at Welsh territory in the 1050s. I want now to look at another aspect of the Norman conquest, which is well known, but perhaps not so well known with association to our part of the world here, and that is the harrying of the north. When William comes to the throne, the general feeling is that he wants to rule rather like Canute. another conqueror from 40 years earlier. And that is, he wanted to use the infrastructure that was already here, both in the church and in government. However, a number of uprisings, within a few years of his the conquest, persuade him that that is not going to be possible. And so after 1068, his policy changes completely, and he proceeds to more or less wipe out the English structure of ownership and of the church and replace it with Normans or with Norman associates. And if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that there are a number of risings in East Anglia there, we've talked about. The border is always unsettled, and a lot going on in the border prior to 1066, but it is a centre for rebellion after the conquest, and also down here in the south-west, around Montacute and around Exeter. But the big one was up here in the north, where there is a series of major uprisings, and William's answer to this is to march army up there, a Norman army up there, and wreak havoc on the ground, laying waste large areas of Yorkshire and Northumberland in particular, up here, and this is known as the harrying of the north. But what I want to do is to point out that the harrying of the north doesn't stop in the north. What we're looking at here are entries in the Domesday Book which are recorded as waste. That is land that is of no value at the point where the Domesday Commissioners surveyed it. And you can see this big concentration up here in the north, but it also comes right down the Pennines and into the West Midlands, into Cheshire here. Nantwich and the salt works there are very badly affected, down into Shropshire and into Herefordshire. And you can see there's this concentration. Now, some of these are in fact pre-1066. They had been laid waste by Welsh activity, and are waste actually in 1066. But a lot of them, particularly just to the east, these are Norman, caused by the Normans. So the Norman process of intimidation and taking over in a violent way stretches all the way down into Shropshire and into Herefordshire. The Bayer Tapestry actually records this process in sort of without comment. Here you can see a looting party led by a man called Waddard, who was a vassal of Bishop Odo of Bayeux. And you can see they're moving into a village and taking animals and grain and so on. So this happens down in the south. This is in Sussex and occurs immediately after the landing of the invasion fleet. Let us look at waste in Shropshire in particular. You can see on the left there that the waste is in 1066. So these are villes or settlements which have no value in 1066 because they have been subject to Welsh raids. And there's one or two in other parts of the county as well. But then you compare it with 1070. Now 1070 is the median date, when it is assumed that the Normans take over. It may not be 1070, it may be within 10 years of that, but we use this date of 1070 because there are three values given in Domesday Book. One at the point when it was under King Edward, at the end of 1065, at the point that the Norman takes over, the Norman lord takes over, and then in 1086, which is generally thought to be the date of the creation of the Domesday Book. So you can see what happens between 1066 and on your left and 1070. There is no doubt there's a great deal of destruction going on in Shropshire. And this is part of the process of the Norman takeover, partly in response to uprising in Shrewsbury and in Stafford, but also really, I think, part of the process of actually forcibly taking over land in the 1070s. Another little extract from the Bayeux Tapestry shows, without comment actually, it just says, here's a house on fire, and what's happening is that Norman soldiers are setting light to quite a grand villa, a two-story villa with an undercroft from which a woman and her child are escaping, but clearly it is a much more serious event, and the fact that it is recorded without comment in the Bayeux Tapestry suggests that it was a common occurrence, and it's precisely this that we're seeing on the ground in those maps of destruction. In Shropshire, in 1066, there were 43 waste villas, and that's due to the Welsh uprising. But by 1070, there were 121, 3 times as many. And then by 1086, many of those had returned to, had got regained value, but in many cases only partly. So that gives you some idea of the scale of what is going on. Below, we're talking about the holdings of the Sheriff of Shropshire, a man called Reynold, who was appointed by Roger de Montgomery. He held 71 estates in 1086. Of these, 22 were waste when he acquired them, and 27 were still worth less in 1086. And a couple of extracts from Domesday Book there. West Felton, up in the northwest of Shropshire, it was and is waste, it records, and Maesbrook and Tipperton, these 2 manors were waste, like many others in Shropshire. So you can see that this process of the harrying of the north comes further south. In terms of the long-term impact on the landscape, I'm not sure there is. Have I gone to there? Oops. I'm not sure there is any real evidence that we can show to suggest that there is sort of long-term. We don't know. Maybe 1 or 2 of these settlements, where we haven't actually identified where they are on the ground, just do disappear at the point of the Norman Conquest, but that's sort of an open question. I want to talk a little bit about this guy, Orderic Vitalis, because he's a Shropshire lad. He was born at Atcham, just to the south of Shrewsbury. He was the eldest son of a French priest, Odolarius, who married an Englishwoman. And he was sent to Normandy when he was about 10 as an oblate, and he spent the rest of his life at St. Evroul, where he wrote the Historia Ecclesiastica. And he recounts that in 1069, the Welshmen and the men of Chester besieged the royal stronghold of Shrewsbury and were assisted by the native citizens, the powerful and warlike Edric the Wild, and other untamable Englishmen. And then he also says, the rebels burnt the town and retired before reinforcements from King William's army in the north could arrive. Aurelius actually is in receipt of wealth from 6 churches in Shrewsbury, which were requisitioned by Roger de Montgomery. So there is the seizing of church assets is one of the things that's also going on at this point. And Aurelius, sorry, beg your pardon, Orderic's father, that's easier, received some of this wealth. And it's thought, it's a possibility that he actually is instrumental in founding Shrewsbury Abbey along with Roger de Montgomery, partly in compensation for this early attack on the church. Here is Orderic Vitalis again, and here he's talking generally about the harrying of the north. And he says, King William stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. William made no effort to control his fury, punishing the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops, herds, tools, and food should be burnt to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of starvation. Well, of course, this is all generalized and probably not a reflection of what happened. And some historians have questioned the whole nature of the harrying of the north, but I remain fairly convinced that whatever else is happening, there is a great deal of violence on the ground, which spills over from the northern counties down the Pennines into the West Midlands. I want now to talk about castles, because castles are the things which we associate most with the Norman Conquest, and their introduction. And it's believed, although there are still some other thoughts about this, that the idea of private defense, that is where you defend the lord and his entourage at the expense of the rest of the community, was a Norman innovation. It's possibly not the case, but certainly it becomes writ large after 1066. Now, why I'm showing this, which is an old map of castles pre-1066 in Normandy, is because there are 2 sorts of castle mentioned here. The motte and bailey, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also the enclosure castle. And it's this second one which I think is very important and which is often overlooked. And I suspect that many of the castles that are built in the very early stages of the conquest are enclosure castles. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So that's why I'm showing this, to show that a lot of the castles in Normandy pre-1066 are enclosure castles, don't have a motte attached to them. There's an example. This is actually right down in the south, South Wales, with a ringwork, which you can see there, which is simply, very simply, an enclosure with an earthwork around it and a ditch, and probably a gatehouse at the entrance there. So when we're talking about enclosure castles, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about. And I suspect that many motte and baileys start off like this in the first instance. I just put this on to try and illustrate what is going on. This is a reconstruction of an enclosure castle with a gatehouse there. There's the enclosure with interior buildings, hall and perhaps chapel. And there's this 16th century gatehouse at Brockhampton over the ditch, over sort of a moat in this case. And I think those two, that is a tradition which goes back clearly probably to late Saxon times. And we do know something about what's happening in late Saxon times, because we are told to become a thane, a churl had to have 5 hides of land, a church and a kitchen, a bell house and a gatehouse. And it's suggested that the fact if you have a gatehouse, it does suggest that you actually have an enclosure that goes with it. So it may well be that the enclosure castle is here prior to 1066. I also put these on, these are sort of wooden towers of churches in Worcestershire which survived, and I think this is a tradition which would have been very, very common in the Welsh Marches in the perhaps even in the late Saxon period, certainly in the post-conquest period. And what you see, one of the problems with a gatehouse that we were looking at is that they are subject to burning. And here you can see the castle at Dinan in Brittany, which is being fired by Norman troops in the Breton campaign of 1064. And this is quite a nice example of a motte and bailey, which is portrayed on the Bayeux tapestry. There's the mound, and then this tower on the top, which could easily have started off as one of the wooden towers I've just been talking about, with earth piled up around it to create a protection for the tower, and then eventually becoming a mound with a tower on the top. And there's some evidence that this is how that particular form of fortification developed. This will be familiar to you, Ludlow, founded in the mid-1070s. There was not a town here prior to 1066. In fact, there are only 2 towns in Shropshire prior to 1066, Shrewsbury and Quatford, which is a Saxon fortification on the river to the south of Bridgnorth. But what the Normans do, as I showed before, is that they create a castle here. There's the castle down there, and add to it a town. Ludlow is a very early foundation, with it probably going quite strong by 1100, and it was part of this dual process of creating a fortification, but also an urban centre for trade and concentration of Norman activity. So urbanization is certainly one of the things that we can tie down to the Normans, that the vast majority of the small towns in Shropshire are post-Norman creations. But I want to look at the castle at Ludlow in a little bit more detail, actually. There's the plan, sorry, that's a bit fuzzy on the right, but there's the plan of Ludlow, possible phases of construction, but we didn't bother about that. But what we do know is that the castle here in the, anyway, you can see it on the left there, is built in the 1070s. But it's not the extended castle we see today. It is, in fact, just the corner bit that you can see with the buildings in black. And if you look at this, what in fact you're looking at is a stone version of an earthwork castle. That is, the pointer has given up on me, or I've given up. Oh, no, it hasn't. Come on. Welcome back. There is the great keep, and there is the enclosure. Now, the keep starts off its life as a gatehouse, but in this case, a stone gatehouse, one of the relatively few early stone structures associated with the Norman Conquest. But what I'm really pointing out is that you could translate this into timber and earth, and you would have an enclosure castle. And if you look at the castle, the keep, there you can see, I'm not sure what this is doing on there, but there's what is now the keep, but originally there was an entrance that went through the tower, and there, if you look there, you can just see the blocked-in entrance that went originally through there. So originally, this was essentially a gatehouse. Later on, the entrance is moved to the right, to the east, and this becomes a keep. But it is a very early example of a Norman keep a castle, and there are relatively few of these in Britain. Most of the big ones that we know about, Dover and Rochester and so on, are built in the 12th century, 30, 40, 50 years after the conquest. So buildings like this in stone are fairly rare. We have two very good examples in the Welsh Marches, here and at Chepstow. I thought I must show you this circular nave. I'm sure you all know it, but this is an extraordinary piece of architecture within the inner bailey of the castle, built in the middle of the 12th century, probably influenced by the Templars, and it is a circular nave, and the chancel goes down here like that. But it is an extraordinary survival. There are very few circular churches of this age surviving in England. Just point out another of the major castles down here at Chepstow, right on the south. Chepstow, the southernmost point of Offa's Dyke, and the entrance to Wales. And clearly, what happened was that they wanted to build a formidable statement about the Norman presence. And that's what Chepstow Castle is. But there are also other castles built by Fitzosborne. Fitzosborne is the Earl of Hereford, based at Hereford, obviously, and sending out castles at Clifford. This is Clifford here on the Wye, further west. Lewis Harold takes over there, Monmouth, Wigmore, of course, Richard's Castle, and possibly Ludlow within that. But there's some discussion about whether Ludlow is specifically linked to Fitzosborne. There's the castle at Chepstow, overlooking the estuary of the Wye, and you can see here that this is a great box, a sort of shoebox of a building. That's the original keep, and you note it isn't a tower. It is in fact a rectangular, almost a basilica type structure, which mirrored the sort of buildings that were being constructed in Normandy at the time. If I move on. There you can see with the Romanesque archway. Now this is an early one as well. Again, it's probably being built within a few years of the conquest, and it is a great statement about you are now entering sort of Norman Wales, as it were, although it wasn't Welsh at this point. It clearly has Roman overtones to it, and it reuses Roman material, quite a lot of Roman material. The courses of Roman tile bought from Roman town, and also Roman stone being deliberately used, perhaps as an indication that these are another conquering race in the same mold as the Romans. I put this on because this is L'Île Bon, which is was a ducal palace in Normandy, which it's pre-conquest. It was destroyed in the 19th century, unfortunately, but it is exactly the same sort of structure that we see at Chepstow. They're bringing that directly over. So we're not always dealing with these towers which we associate with the Normans. I thought I'd quickly show a Motte Bailey, or a sort of mock-up of a Motte Bailey. There's the mound on the left. Norman French for mound is motte, and there it is. The Bailey, I've talked about the tower on the top, with the palisade going around that, and then a bridge structure from the inner Bailey. And then within the inner Bailey, you have a number of buildings, a hall, a chapel, stables, ancillary buildings, and so on. And within Shropshire has one of the densest concentration of Motte Baileys anywhere in the country. Many of them are quite small. This is Brompton Mill near Cherbury, which is quite a modest one by Norman standards. You can see the sheep kindly acting as measure there. And there you can see, again, a extract from the tapestry showing the building of Hastings Castle, and the mound there behind with a tower on the top with the overseer. That isn't actually William the Conqueror. That's a guy called Wymark, who is a sort of who is actually here before the conquest. I could talk a lot about this, but I'm not going to move on. And this is the typical Motte Bailey. This is Castle Pulverbatch. And Castle Pulverbatch, one of these castles that you get in the Vale of Montgomery, both in the Severn Valley and then into the Vale of Montgomery, which were created by Roger de Montgomery. You can see the mound and the attached enclosure to it showing up in earthwork form there. Very, very neat example. I want to talk a little bit about Roger de Montgomery. There he is. This, in fact, I think is an 18th century version of him, which is in the museum at Shrewsbury. They don't seem to know what it dates from either, but I think it's 18th century. And he held a number of castles in Shropshire, which are named in Domesday: Shrewsbury, Oswestry, Holdgate, again not far from here, held by a man called Helgot, giving his name to Holdgate. It's quite an unusual naming process, because not that many villages are named after Normans. And Montgomery, of course, Montgomery is named after Roger de Montgomery. Quatford, predecessor of Bridgenorth. And there were almost certainly Roger de Montgomery castles at Clun, Cawes, Bishop's Castle. And I've talked a little bit about Ludlow at the bottom there. So he's the main man. He becomes Earl of Shrewsbury about 1070, Earl of Shropshire, sorry, and he basically acts as the king's ensign in the marches, as does Fitzosborne to the south, and they have royal powers. In fact, Roger de Montgomery inherits all the land which had belonged to Edward the Confessor, which in other counties further eastwards went directly to the king. So he's acting basically as the crown, and he's given the area of Shropshire with a mandate to move further westwards at his leisure and pleasure. He was born at Montgomery in the Emois, and he described himself very much as a Norseman of Norse men, that he saw himself as a direct descendant of the Vikings that went into Normandy. He married Mabel de Balaam, who held estates in the southern part of Normandy, and he made his name very much by protecting and expanding his wife's lands in the south of Normandy, moving into Maine, taking over parts of Maine. So he had a sort of a rehearsal for the Welsh activity here in Normandy, fighting in Marcher territory and taking over other land. And he also appeared at the siege of Domfront, and he was a close advisor to Matilda during he didn't actually take part in the conquest, but it stayed behind in Normandy. And he was given two critical areas after the conquest: the Rape of Arundel, which is basically Sussex, West Sussex, and about 85% of Shropshire. And it could have been made Earl of Shrewsbury as early as 1068. This is just to locate us in Normandy. There's Montgomery right in the middle of Normandy, but he marries Mabel de Bellême down here, and you can see how he pushes across the Norman frontier into Maine, and undertaking this process of bringing Maine under Norman control in what is a Marcher area in Normandy. And here is what happens to this part of the world immediately after the conquest, divided into three: earldom of Chester to the top, earldom of Shrewsbury, and the earldom of Hereford. And you can see there that although the eastern boundaries are defined, the western boundaries are not defined, because they are given full remit to move as far westwards as they can. There was no sort of they weren't sort of contained within Offa's Dyke. In fact, they were encouraged to move westward, basically to sort of stop the attacks, but also did the same process of land acquisition in Wales as they had done in England. And there you can see how these castles, some of these castles, act as the base of the attack into Wales. In particular, Cawes here. If I've got time, I shall get to Cawes, but I may not. And how one arm of the Montgomery family went down into Pembrokeshire and established a Montgomery dynasty down here in the southwest of Wales, very soon after the conquest. Shrewsbury is a town which is here before the conquest. It has a mint about the year 1000. It is the successor to Wroxeter, but a delayed successor. That is the Roman town to the south. And we still don't know precisely the line of the defences here, but it is a town which is heavily influenced by the Normans, in particular with the building of a castle at this the narrowest point of this loop in the River Severn there. There's the castle there, and they also built an abbey here. Roger de Montgomery built both the castle and the abbey. Obviously wasn't space for a large abbey within the area of the town, but just outside the town there. And there you can see the impact of the Normans, with the castle being constructed there, and there's the abbey. And although Shrewsbury itself is not a Norman creation, this area down here, the foregate of the abbey, now known as Abbey Foregate, was. So there you have them creating another urban centre attached to the abbey in this case. This is one of Chris Mustard's pictures of the castle at Shrewsbury. Difficult place to photograph, partly because it's been much intruded on by the railway, and also it's been much rebuilt. But it is a Motte and Bailey. There's the motte, and this was the bailey there. And in fact, if I go on to the next one, yeah, you can see here that if you take away all the sort of later accoutrements, you can see how it is fundamentally a motte and bailey castle constructed by Roger de Montgomery within a very few years of the conquest, and acts as a major base for the conquest of Wales. And that's a sort of later drawing of the motte. I've already talked about the damage done to Shrewsbury by the Normans. The building of the castle actually causes a good deal of trouble as well. They took over some 51 dwellings, and another 50 dwellings are unoccupied, and French burgesses have also taken over. So there's a big takeover, laying waste large areas of the Anglo-Saxon town and rehousing with Frenchmen there. I don't have time to go into that, I'm sorry. There's a view of the abbey from the castle. I try to tie the two together, but it's quite difficult because, as I say, you've got the railway line and the whole railway station in between. And all this said is how Roger founded an abbey in Shrewsbury, and he did it together with Oderic's father, Odelirius, and they built this Benedictine monastery, housed it with monks from St. Martin de Sade. And as you're going to hear later on, the Norman Conquest is a prelude to an enormous expansion in monasticism. Not immediately. There are only a few monasteries founded within a decade or so of the conquest, but within 50, 60 years, then it becomes an avalanche of new monastic institutions. There's Shrewsbury Abbey, you'll be familiar with. It was much larger until Thomas Telford came along and built his road through the cloisters. This is the Abbey Foregate that I was talking about. I do want to go back and just to show inside. Golly, do you know I've been doing this job for 60 years and I still haven't learned how to keep to time. There's the inside of the Abbey, and you can see that the Abbey is built on a sort of formidable basis with the tower, with the columns there, very similar to, presumably, to the structure of the castle, which was being built roughly at the same time. Roger also refounded the Abbey, the Priory at Much Wenlock, and Bridge North was founded by Roger de Montgomery's son, who was the third Earl of Shrewsbury, who actually fell from grace, and with him the whole panoply of the earldom fell. The king took over Shropshire directly after Robert rebelled against him, but he built this castle. So this is quite an early stone castle as well. And you can see again, it is a Norman town for all practical purposes, with the castle and down here, and an outer bailey essentially there, with the west and east Castle Street, and then another outer area for the urbanization. Another town which is a Norman creation is Oswestry, and you may not know about Oswestry Castle, but there it is, built by the Sheriff of Shropshire, who is Roger de Montgomery's man, and it has been now sort of completely isolated by roads, and it just sits there by itself. But if you look at it here on this first edition of the 25-inch map, you can see that there's the castle, and the shape of the inner part of Oswestry reflects the Bailey, and the names of the streets are Bailey Street and Castle Street and so on. So all of this is really a reflection of the Norman creation in the late 11th century. Yeah, there's another big story behind Oswestry, but there you can see this sort of rather pathetic bit of castle marooned in the middle of Rhodes there. I do want to talk about Clun. Here is another one of these big castles built by a major vassal of Roger, Pico de Say, and this is what Clun looks like today. One of the things which I thought I would point out is that this tower, which is the most formidable bit of surviving masonry there, is in fact a much later construction. It's a sort of 12th, 13th century construction on Norman lines. But it's not serious. It is, in fact, probably just no more than a hunting lodge. But it was rebuilt to be formidable, to look like a Norman castle, as indeed was Hopton Castle, close by, built again a couple of hundred years after the Conquest, where they were sort of harking back to the Normans and imitating their building style, but much, much later, and in different circumstances by that stage. Also, these two turrets, you can see here, which look facing towards Wales, but they're filled in, they're blank, so you couldn't have used them for any form of defense. Anyway, that's another story. Clun town is, you can see there's the castle, and you see how the town is an adjunct to it. So Clun is not a big town, but that too, like Bridge North, it reflects the fact that it was laid out within the shadow of the Norman castle. I am going to finish here, I promise you. This is Horcock's Mount, which was an original castle down there, a very early castle, but a ringwork castle. And then Cawes Castle, which is not so well known, the headquarters of the Corbett family, another major vassals of Roger. And here they had a great castle mount. It's built within an Iron Age hill fort there. There's the castle and its bailey. And I think I've got a picture now. Yeah, you can see how immense that castle mound is. Very difficult to see it because it's covered in trees, but it is absolutely immense. One of the biggest in the Welsh Marches. And this was a very, very important centre for movement into Wales. And Cawes, like Richard's Castle, like Ewes Harold, fades away in the later Middle Ages. It becomes redundant and it sort of sinks beneath the weight of its own defences and is abandoned. It's a failed medieval town. There's the plan on the left, and there you can see the area of the town on the right within the defences of the earthworks of the Motte Bailey, of the hill fort. I'm sorry this is, again, very faded. It's a very old slide, but I took it, again, this is taken in the 1960s, believe it or not, and what you're looking at here is a wall of the Norman town. And it's just been revealed by this tree which has grown up against it. And you can see how thick, enormous thick. There's nothing of this survives on the ground. You wouldn't know unless you saw that little profile about the nature of the defences at Cawes. Now, I'm sorry, I have gone on too long already. I could have gone on a bit longer, but I'm going to stop at that point. And thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.
Gosh. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Another layering on the landscape of the Marches. So just a few quick questions before lunch. Anybody?
Yeah, right, there's somebody, there's somebody at home, I think. Clive, yeah?
To what extent do you regard the importation and sponsorship of the Cistercian movement, the effect from Normandy and the construction of their great abbeys and estates, as an important agency in this Norman stabilisation?
I'm sorry, it's a bit muffled.
Well, it's actually a question about the Cistercian impact. So I think I suggest that we hold that question over, because I think it's more appropriately a question to put to Janet when Janet gives us the talk after the lunch break.
Yeah, I can say, as I said, there are not that large number of monasteries founded immediately after the conquest, and they tend to be Benedictine. Places like Lewes and Shrewsbury in particular. But by the beginning of the 12th century, the floodgates open with the Cistercians, and you'll hear about that later on. Whether they would have happened without the Norman Conquest on this scale, I'm not sure, because the Normans had a lot of land, and many of them were endowing monasteries in this country. To begin with, a lot of their wealth is going back to Normandy, and they're founding and embellishing monasteries in Normandy in the 1070s and 1080s. But once you get into the 12th century, then it's going into this sort of great expansion of English monasteries. But you'll hear all about that later on.
Right, a couple of questions, and then I think we'll have to finish for lunch.
Hello. In terms of Richard's Castle, which you mentioned earlier, how did it go with the administration when they built that castle? Because surely it was going to be some trouble ahead for the existing administration of the area.
I'm sorry again, it's very muffled. So
oh, sorry. Yeah. Is that better? So thinking about Richard's Castle and when it was built, about the administration that was governing the local area, how would they be able to build a castle of that size and structure in terms of the threat that poses to the existing sort of power base in the area? I was just wondering about the dynamics about how they actually built that castle, because it just seems strange.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, yes. One of the great complaints of the English, the Anglo-Saxons, is the castle. They suggest it's not really fair because we didn't have castles and they do. And the conquest of England would not have been possible without the castle, which acts as a series of protected bases from which Norman control, Norman taxation, Norman military can permeate outwards. Many of them were built with English labour forced upon them. That again is something that comes up in the contemporary documents, that English men are being forced to build these castles for these devils.
Okay, and one final question.
Just a quick one. On the modern bailies, were the mottes always man-made, or were they ever natural? Because they were very substantial, as we saw, of course. Were these made by manual labour?
For the most part, they are all man-made. Occasionally, they're built on existing burial mounds. There's one at Marlborough, which is built on top of an existing prehistoric burial mound. But for the most part, they are completely man-made. They are formidable constructions, which often they are actually built within earlier complexes, like the cores, where they're built within a hill fort, or they're often built within Roman fortifications at a wall in Herefordshire, Longtown, sorry, in Herefordshire. But for the most part, they are completely built from the ground level. well, built, they dig a well to begin with, then as they build it up, they build the well up with it, so, because they've got a water at the top. Anyway, sorry.
But that reminds me of a question that I asked Keith. Keith won't remember. But about 5 or 6 years ago, when I attended a talk that Keith was giving, and he had images of some pre-medieval mounds. And I said to Keith in the questions, if he had just shown those to me as a picture, I'd have said they were a motte. And the question was, without archaeological work, how do we know whether a mound is a motte or whether it is pre-medieval? And I think, Keith, your answer was often it's just a hunch.
It is true that the very few have been excavated. Hendomen is one of the few mounds that have been investigated under modern circumstances. But that is actually does start at ground level. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much to both our morning speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you.